So, Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. Again, it's the second interview we're doing for Hromadske. I will start with the anti-corruption summit that is being hosted by the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And we know it's been announced that one of the key topics of this anti-corruption summit is the Panama Papers. We also know that President Poroshenko's name was figuring in the leaks. So my question would be, instead of new promises made by the President Poroshenko and Ukrainian leadership, what specific steps could Ukrainian leadership and personally President Poroshenko take to show that he's really serious about tackling corruption?
Well, let me just put the anti-corruption global summit into context, if I may, just for a moment. The summit was announced by the Prime Minister last year when he made a trip to Singapore, long before we had any idea about Panama Papers or anything like that. And I think it comes from our Prime Minister's very strongly held view that we need to tackle corruption on a global basis. And I think his objectives are three or fourfold. One is to eradicate corruption around the world, to expose it and to punish those who are engaged in corruption. The second is to prosecute those who are guilty of corruption. And the third is to prevent corruption, so that it's not just enough to expose it and hold those accountable who commit acts which are corrupt, but also to prevent it happening again. And that requires a global approach, because in the 21st century, if somebody makes illegal profits somewhere, they quite often launder them or invest them somewhere else. It's a global problem. And we've been very clear that we need a global approach, which is why the summit is happening on the 12th of May this week. Now, there will be 41 nations who are attending the summit, 6 international organizations, and representatives from civil society and business. Now that's really important, because this is not just about a government approach. We need government and civil society to work with us. I'm very pleased that Ukraine will be attending the summit. I think that's really important. The invitations went out to G20 nations and those countries who have a story to tell on corruption or are showing a commitment to tackling corruption. Now, I think this is a really important opportunity for Ukraine. Unfortunately, for far too many people, Ukraine is synonymous with the word corruption, and I think that is a huge issue for the country. It prevents inward investment, it strangles development, it strangles prosperity, and we want to see a secure, prosperous and safe Ukraine founded on European values. Now, what we will see coming out of this summit, I don't want to preempt a couple of days beforehand, but there will be a summit declaration and there will be a summit communique, and as part of that, each country present will produce their own action plan, outlining the steps that they will take further to tackle corruption. I think for Ukraine, we have to be clear that there has been progress already under this government. I think if you look at what has been done with the police force, procurement with Prozoro, for example, some of the legislation that's already been passed on public administration reform, these are all good steps in the right direction. But there are some very clear things that, from when I speak to Ukrainians, they are very clear that need to happen. And I think we, the international community, are also clear that they need to happen. At the top of that list has to be reform of the General Prosecutor's Office and the judiciary. I think electoral reform and party political financing. I am very struck by how low the level of confidence is in the RADA, and that, as your country's democratic institution, really should be higher in people's estimation. So I think there are a lot of things that really need to be tackled by the current government, and it's a new government, and we will be looking to see progress happen very, very quickly. And this summit is a real opportunity, I think, for Ukraine to say, this is what we have done so far, because things have been done, but actually this is what we're going to do over the coming weeks and months.
Weeks and months.
Some of it will take longer than that, but I think there is also, from what I see, a real desire, both amongst the international community and domestically in Ukraine, to see swift progress. People need to believe and see that corruption is being tackled.
You were stressing in our previous interview, in the first interview, and it's a known formula that corruption should be tackled from top down. Given the president's influence and actual power over the General Prosecutor's Office, Why do you think it is so hard to do in Ukraine?
Clearly that's something you will have to ask the President.
Sure, we will.
But I think the General Prosecutor's office has become so symbolic of the fight against corruption in this country. And it's not just about one man and one individual. Yes, it's absolutely right that we are now looking at a new General Prosecutor. That new person needs to be appointed quickly and needs to have the confidence of the electorate, of Ukrainians, and the international community, I would add. But it's not just about appointing one figure. The whole of the General Prosecutor's office needs to be reformed. People need to have confidence in the judiciary in Ukraine. When I'm in the UK, I am very confident that if I do something wrong, I will be punished and possibly go to prison for it. I'm also very confident that if I don't do anything wrong, I have nothing to worry about. And I think Ukrainians need to have that same sense of trust in their institutions, and in particular the judiciary. And if we want to see inward investment into Ukraine, and I would love to see more British companies coming into Ukraine, they need to have confidence that the judiciary works, is fair, and is equally accessible to everybody, and that there aren't special privileges for the certain few who happen to be in positions of responsibility or proximity to those in power.
Mm-hmm. There were lots of statements from observers, international experts, from the media and civil society, asking international community, European and American allies, to be more harsh and more strong on Ukrainian leadership, making them show that they're serious about these steps. What do you think are the main instruments still in hands?
Well, I think there is a very clear incentive for Ukraine. Ukraine has chosen a European path. Ukrainians tell me on a daily basis that this country is European and Europe. Europe is based upon certain values, and corruption runs counter to those values. Corruption is not something that fits with European values, if I can say that, because it's about people benefiting from breaking the rules and gaining reward from playing outside of the rules or breaking the rules. That doesn't really fit with how we see Europe and the European Union. Now, nobody is saying that we are perfect, and let's be very, very clear that every country has a job to do in tackling corruption. And I think that's, one of the things that we understand in London. We have a reputation for certain things in London, either through our overseas territories or through the City of London, and we take steps to tackle that and have done so. But I think what we have to work with is the fact that according to all the indexes, you look at Transparency International and their index, the UK is 10th in the corruption perceptions ratings. Ukraine is 130th out of 168 countries. That's a really difficult statistic, and we want to see Ukraine progress and move forward and tackle corruption. And I think there is the desire, certainly amongst ordinary Ukrainians, because at the end of the day, this is their money. Corruption breeds inequality, it breeds insecurity. I think there are some quite powerful statistics that show that amongst the 10 most corrupt countries in the world, and Ukraine isn't in that league, but among the 10th most corrupt countries in the world, 5 of those countries are the least peaceful countries in the world. So corruption breeds insecurity as well. And what we really want to see, and I think what Ukrainians want to see, and this is the biggest incentive, is a country that is prosperous, secure, and stable. And tackling corruption has to be at the heart of that. And we continue to provide assistance to help that. We provide millions of pounds worth of support to support reform in this country, to tackle corruption. The United Kingdom has been instrumental in helping set up the NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, training detectives. And we will continue to make the case for the long-term prosperity of Ukraine, lying in a system that is based upon adhering to the rules and institutions that people can trust and have faith in.
Talking about London's reputation, especially among Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. London is one of the mostly beloved places, and we know that some investigations show that very well-known Ukrainian oligarchs like Dmytro Firtash owns a very costly, expensive real estate, a former metro station actually, which costs more than £50 million. Rinat Akhmetov, which was known for his alliance with the former president Viktor Yanukovych. The investigations show that he owns one of the most expensive apartments in London. What do you think the British government could do to be sure about the sources from which these people have money to buy this kind of property?
I mean, I think first and foremost, we're very proud of London as the world's greatest financial centre. And I think part of its success has been based on its openness. We are not a country that is prone to protectionism. We have very open markets. Now, of course, the risk with that sometimes is that people can abuse that openness and the principles upon which our markets are based. Where we have evidence and we receive evidence of wrongdoing, we will always investigate it. I can't comment on individual cases because that would be prejudicial, but we do investigate cases where evidence is presented, and it's always important that where people have evidence of wrongdoing or of corruption, that they prevent that evidence. I think we're absolutely clear that we need to look at issues around our markets, which is why over the past 5 or 6 years we've taken a number of steps. So, for example, in 2010 we introduced some of the toughest legislation in the world to tackle bribery. Not only is it an offence in the UK to pay a bribe, it's also an offence to not prevent somebody else paying a bribe. So we have some of the toughest legislation that we've introduced in the world for that. We have also, and will shortly be the first country in the G20 to launch a centrally held, publicly available registry on beneficial company ownership. Because one of the issues, of course, is actually understanding who owns what. And if people can hide behind various corporate structures and identities, that doesn't actually help. So that will go live in June. And we've also been working to tackle the issue of tax evasion and have repatriated more than £2 billion worth of offshore really should have come back to the UK. So there's a lot we're doing. There is a lot more that we still need to do. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're hosting this summit this week, is because it's not just a problem in the UK, it's a global problem. And if you have a global financial centre, of course, you are going to have concerns about what comes through that. But we're not complacent. We know that we have to work to address that, and that is precisely why we're having this type of summit.
Mm-hmm. There is also an idea circulating, I'm not talking about some specific people, that personal sanctions is a good instrument as well. Not only against, and it works against some Russian oligarchs or former politicians or ministers. Do you think that instrument could also be introduced to some former Ukrainian authorities or authorities who are in power, whose, let's say, abuse of power or tax evasion has been proved?
I think it all comes down to the evidential basis. And I think the thing with sanctions, as we have seen with sanctions over the past couple of years, and we know there have been sanctions related to this country, is you need to have a very clear legal and evidential basis for personal sanctions. So they are a tool, they are a means of restricting certain behaviours, and there are already powers that exist, but you do need a strong evidential basis and a strong rationale to be able to do it.
Well, as Ukrainian experience proves, sometimes there's a lack of political will to proceed with prosecution or with some, let's say, legal proofs of abuse of power, even when we're talking about former politicians, former ministers of and former Yanukovych allies. How does that work internationally?
I think there is genuine puzzlement internationally, and I think within Ukraine, from people I've spoken to, as to why we have not seen more prosecutions of people from previous regimes or people in significant positions about whom there are allegations of corruption. And we're not talking about convictions here, but actually bringing the cases in the first place. And I think people find that surprising. Where you have such a clear reputation and quite a bit of evidence out there that corruption is endemic in Ukraine, it is difficult to understand why cases have not been brought. And that is something that I think people need to think about going forward, because it's very difficult at a local level where we know from the people we speak to and experiences that we have that corruption can be a daily way of life in order to get yourself a place in school or in university or healthcare. It's very hard for people at that level to say, well, I won't do it, if people think that the top of society is also doing it. And that's something that really needs to be tackled, and overcoming that culture is a real challenge and has to be from the top down.
You were talking about puzzlement, but is there an understanding of possible reasons of why is that happening?
Why is what happening?
Puzzlement about the lack of evidence in courts, if we're talking about the previous regime.
I mean, again, I think people are genuinely curious to know why there have not been more prosecutions, or in fact, I think any notable prosecutions of senior figures from the previous regime, or senior figures about whom people have real concerns about their probity and the way that they conduct their business. And at the end of the day, this is not about individuals as such, but it's about the long-term future of this country, which should be a rich and prosperous country. You have the natural resources, you have the human capital. I never fail to be impressed by just how talented Ukrainians are, and the potential of this country. And it's not just about agriculture or natural resources, but in the IT sector and outsourcing. There's huge potential for this country to be able to tap into global markets and to bring in external investment. But the issue of corruption really needs to be tackled if that's to be realised.
Mm-hmm. I would like to talk about the role of Great Britain in the Minsk process. Even though not formal, still Great Britain is a great partner of Ukraine and is a participant of Budapest Memorandum. And we have heard recently that there is a new deadline for Ukraine to reach the Minsk agreements, because it's way over deadline 2015, right? So there is a deadline which is end of summer, when Ukraine needs to stick to the agreements and hold the elections in Donbass. With all the complications, with the ongoing shootings and Russia still at the border, let's say with the borders still open, how do you think that is possible?
I think the first thing to say is we support the Minsk process and the Normandy format. It has certainly been an agreement that has helped bring down the fighting and has created some space for negotiation. Now, I know it's difficult, and I think it is a process that will take some time. I think the biggest challenge is the first provision of the agreement, which is a full ceasefire. That is not yet in place. And I think until such time as there is a clear and credible sustained ceasefire in place, it is very difficult to see how elections can take place in an environment where there is no safety and security guaranteed. Now, there is work ongoing to try and look at how the international community can help in terms of providing extra security. But what we do really need to remember is that there is an aggressor here and a victim, and the victim is Ukraine, and the aggressor lies further to your east. And we need greater space to allow Ukraine to deliver her part of the agreement, which is elections, amnesty, and constitutional amendments. That's all understood, but you do need the space and the security in which to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm. But given the situation in the parliament and so much controversy in society and among political establishment, how real is that deadline? How real that deadline seems to you?
I mean, I'm not aware of any formal deadline. I mean, certainly people want to see things move forward. Because at the end of the day, let's be very, very clear, this is about people's lives. There are real people who have suffered as a result of the conflict in the Donbass. Over 2 million people displaced, over 9,000 people killed. over 20,000 people injured. This has a real human cost, and these are people who are suffering on a daily basis, and we want to see an end to that and a return to normal life. That, of course, is now very difficult to do. But I think we have to understand that we need to make some progress, but the preconditions for progress are around a ceasefire and stability in order to be able to allow people to deliver their side of the bargain. And what we need to see is some real indication, actually, that Russia is engaging in this process with good faith and has the will herself to move the Minsk agreements forward.
Do you think a possible OSCE military mission, military police, so to say, could contribute to that security, state of security?
Well, I think we have to look first at the sequencing and how we move towards elections in that process. I don't think anybody's talking about a military mission. I mean, the OSCE is not an organisation that has conducted military missions. There is a monitoring mission there now, and I think the conversation is very much around how we look at an international presence that can give a greater assurance for those who want to vote when the elections happen. Now, that's not easy, and that will require negotiation. But I think it's important that the international community remains engaged and committed to a peaceful solution to this conflict.
Mm-hmm. We have been hearing recently from Ukrainian president and from the government as well that there should be a diplomatic and humanitarian solution to the conflict. In your opinion, as a diplomat, what do you think Ukraine still has to do, still has to focus in the framework of diplomatic solution? I'm talking about interaction with the IDPs and interaction with the people in occupied territories. What is actually this possible diplomatic solution to, especially to the people who are now living in occupied territories?
I think it's always a challenge. It's a challenge to communicate into territories which you no longer control. But at the end of the day, these are Ukrainian citizens who largely certainly didn't choose the situation that they're currently in. And I think it's important to keep the channels of communication going. And I think it's important to support IDPs and to support people who, through no fault of their own, have found themselves in a terrible situation and who struggle on a day-to-day basis to access services, to find food that is affordable, to access their pensions and their social benefits. So I think it's really important that people remember, people in the Donbass are Ukrainians too. They haven't chosen this. This is something that has been imposed upon them. There would be no conflict in the Donbass had Russia not interfered. And it's very important that people remember that.
You were an ambassador to Georgia previously to this office. There were lots of debates about the Georgian experience being applied here to Ukraine. What do you think is the main difference? Why some of the things done in Georgia couldn't be done in Ukraine?
It's a question I get often, and I think, the first and most obvious answer is Georgia and Ukraine are two very different countries. I think the scale, for a start, Georgia, a country of between 3 and 4 million, Ukraine is at least 10 times larger than Georgia. I think different peoples as well, although there is shared experience, both having been republics in the Soviet Union. But I think there are some other differences too. Georgia had a problem with corruption, but certainly not to the extent that Ukraine has had a problem with corruption. I think the task here is so much bigger than it was in Georgia. I think what Georgia has also been quite clever at doing is stripping out bureaucracy and red tape, and I think that's still a challenge for Ukraine. There is a real cultural instinct in Ukraine to create a law or a piece of legislation for everything. And the rate at which your parliament passes legislation is quite astounding. It's heroic in some ways, but it's also quite astounding. So I think what Georgia was able to do was to strip out a lot of the red tape and bureaucracy and move on in that area. I think that's still very much a challenge in Ukraine. But I think also Georgia had a different relationship with Russia. And I think that is also important.
Different in what way?
I think there is a sense that it's quite hard to quantify, but in terms of the fact that Georgia has never been wrapped up in people's minds as being part of the same whole in quite the same way that Ukraine has. There's not quite the same shared history with Georgia as there is between Russia and Ukraine. And I think that marks an important distinction.
Why do you think is the reason, as many believe, I don't know, maybe you do not agree with this opinion, that the reformers from Georgia are failing as well here? Why do you think is that?
I think, I don't know. I mean, I think I wouldn't separate out your reformers by nationality. I think what we have seen here is a number of very good, talented Ukrainians driving forward reform, and that in certain areas Ukraine has recruited talent from overseas. That is not necessarily an issue. I think the problem comes in making that reform stick and really moving reform forward quickly. And as we've said already, the priorities have to be in the judiciary, I think around electoral reform and actually public administration reform. There have been some good steps recently in terms of passing legislation, changing how you recruit your civil servants. But that needs to be driven forwards. And of course, for an electorate in a reforming society, it's never quick enough. And I think those countries in Eastern Europe who went through this process in the 90s, some of Ukraine's experiences are not dissimilar to that reform is not always easy to push through, but has to keep being pushed. And what you need are these reformers to keep working and using their energies to push that forward. And I think one of the real strengths in Ukraine at the moment is the strength of your civil society, and that's what gives me hope. You have a very strong and vibrant civil society, and you have some very strong and determined new RADA deputies and actually ministers as well.
Well, I ask about the Georgian reformers, not of course because of their nationality, it's because of the experience that they were bringing and stressing that some certain things work out in Georgia, and they were hopeful about the fact that these things may work out in Ukraine, but still it's probably something we'll have to see.
Well, I think some of it has. If you look at what Ekuskoladze has done with the police reform, I think there are areas where they have managed to replicate the Georgian experience. But again, I think there is always a risk of 100% extrapolating experience from one country and transplanting it to another country. What works in one jurisdiction may not work somewhere else.
Madam Ambassador, you've been one of a few diplomats in the world, and specifically in Ukraine, probably the only one I know, who came out public about their sexuality. How hard was a decision for you and your family to move here and to bring your family here in a country where the level of violence against the LGBT community is pretty high?
I think when you take a posting, or certainly when I take a posting, you weigh up a number of factors. One is, can I bring something to this job? Can I make a difference? Do I have the professional skills to do this job? And the other is this an environment in which I think my family will be comfortable? And I thought about it for a long time with Ukraine, but at the end of the day, I come from a country which is diverse and based on a certain set of values. And I don't believe, and neither does my government, that talent or careers should be held back on the basis of sexual orientation or gender or race or belief or anything else. So I didn't think from a professional point of view I should be limiting my career by walking away from a region in which I have been engaged for 20 years. Now, there have been disturbing elements of violence against the LGBT community in Ukraine. I don't think, from my sense of being here, that this is every day, everybody in Ukraine. I think there is an absence of a public debate in Ukraine, and I think there is still a degree of discomfort with having that public debate. We had the same experience in the UK, where it took time for people to become comfortable in talking about these issues. But I think there is a small minority who, for whatever reason, choose to be violent towards people from the LGBT community. I think the important thing is that that should not be tolerated in a country. It's very important to stand up against that. I was speaking at an event earlier this week which commemorated the Holocaust and talking about how we commemorated it earlier in the UK with the slogan "Don't Stand By." Because if you have a community that tolerates discrimination, it allows more extremist views and more horrific things to take root. And I think it's very important that people don't stand by and just accept discrimination or intolerance on any basis. But I think in terms of my ability to do my job here, it's but a very small part of who I am. The fact is, I am Her Majesty's Ambassador to Ukraine, and I have a job to do in supporting Ukraine along her trajectory towards that stable, prosperous and democratic and safe state that we want her to be. This is but a very small part of who I am, and I don't see that it should affect that. And I think having done the interview a few months ago, which in some ways seemed an obvious thing to do, it was no secret, the reaction has been largely positive. Yes, there has been some negative tweeting and some negative messages, and some people have decided to throw a few negative comments in my direction. But the overwhelming response, both in Ukraine and actually globally, I was getting messages from as far afield as Mexico and Brazil and Thailand and New Zealand. The overwhelming response was positive.
In that interview to BuzzFeed, or colleagues from BuzzFeed, you were saying that you were getting more negative comments, not from the local people here in Ukraine, from, I don't know, local, anyone whom you meet, but more from fellow diplomats. Is that true?
I have to say that's not necessarily been the case here, but in my long diplomatic career, I have found sometimes that I have received more double takes or expressions of surprise, the occasional negative comment from other diplomats and not necessarily from my hosts.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us
Thank you.
once again. Thank you.